My mom chose a convicted kitty diddler over her own kids, so I blew their lies apart in court. A year later, she came begging me to save her unborn baby from the monster she let in. I was 15 when I accepted that I would be fatherless for the rest of my life, because I was the son of a single mom archetype. Overworked myself in school while maintaining 25 hours a week at a local job. Took care of my younger brother Mikey while my mom was sick or at work. My biggest dream was to retire my mom so she'd never have to work again. But then it all came crashing down because my mom met a wonderful man named Troy. He was extremely kind, and after just a few months of dating, I finally stopped beating myself up for not being a perfect man of the house anymore. He's still the only reason why I know how to ride a bike, and Mikey loved him even more than I did. Troy taught him how to do math without making him cry, a skill I never learned, and even took the role of bringing him to school every day. Meanwhile, my mom's skin was glowing even more. She genuinely looked beautiful. It truly was the calm before the storm. As we got to know him, the picture-perfect thing faded. I found out he already had another family that he'd left, as well as a son who was around my age. But I loved him regardless. Because what is family if not accepting each other's imperfections, right? Well, this ended up backfiring hard. Because one day when I was in senior year studying for exams, I got a text on Facebook. It was from this guy claiming to be my half-brother. So I scoured his page and saw my dad, or I guess you could say our dad, had been in his profile picture at some point. After establishing our mutual biological connection, I found out he had an ulterior motive for texting me. He started off by asking me if I knew what kind of man our father was. I figured he was just salty that my dad left him for a hotter wife, so I replied saying, "More than you do, buddy." I was really immature back then, I know. Some part of me wanted his response to be something feisty, something I could argue with, but it wasn't. It was something much, much darker. He sent dozens of court documents. They were all about a man named Henry, who had been charged after stealing the innocence of his wife and his 5-year-old son. I figured that my half-brother was just as immature as me, so I didn't read much into it and told him that he was an effing weirdo for sending me that shitty. But as soon as I exited out of the court documents and read his text, my heart dropped. He said the words that changed my life forever, in the worst way possible. Henry is our dad's name, the one he changed to after prison. I fought the urge to throw up into the garbage can beside me. Needing to know more, I reread the documents. The timeline all added up. He had met my mother just 6 months after leaving prison, but that wasn't all. After he had been caught stealing their innocence, an investigation was launched. On his hard drive were dozens of footage of, well, you know, except it wasn't just from kitty fiddling websites. They were home movies that he had made, with him and unclothed innocent beings crying out for help. That time, I couldn't hold back. I threw up onto the keyboard. This was the man my mom had brought into our lives, the man that was doting on Troy. I knew there was no way my mom knew, so I had to decide what to do with the information, but it was practically impossible to think straight. Suddenly, the door creaked open. I spun around in my chair and was faced with Henry looming over me and my computer screen. I knew there was no point fumbling to hide it. Plus, I was bigger than him, so it's not like he could have forced me to do anything like he had with my half-brother. His face went red. I swear, I've changed since then, please. His eyes were filled with so much fake innocence. When I looked at his trembling hands, all I could picture was what he had done to those kids, what I had seen him do. I quickly exited out of all the tabs, got up, and knocked him to the floor. As he began to cry, I couldn't help but laugh. I still remember the sound of his ribs cracking under my boots. It was satisfying, like ASMR. But then I heard my mom come home. "Honey, I think my son is onto us," she yelled, not knowing I was right upstairs. I froze completely. My mom thought I was still at school. She wasn't yelling in alarm. She was joking around with him. I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were cemented to the floor. I heard her footsteps coming up the stairs, getting closer and closer. When she reached the top of the stairs, she saw Henry on the floor, bruised and trembling, and me standing over him. Her face went from confusion to horror in seconds. She dropped her purse and rushed to Henry's side. "What the hell happened?" she demanded, looking up at me with wide eyes. I couldn't even form words at first. My hands were shaking. Finally, I managed to ask the only question that mattered. "Did you know?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She paused. Her eyes darted between me and Henry. Then she lied. "Know what? What are you talking about?" She helped Henry sit up against the wall. "Why would you attack him like this?" I grabbed my phone and showed her some of the court documents. "His son sent me these. His real name is Henry. He's a convicted criminal. Did you know?" Her face changed. She looked down, then back at me. "I only found out recently," she said quietly. "He didn't tell me when we met. He said the court case was false, just revenge from a bitter ex-wife." She stood up and grabbed my arm. "Please don't ruin everything. Look at how much better things have been. Remember how unstable our house was before he came? Remember how much I struggled?" I pulled away from her. "You're lying. You knew. I heard what you said when you came in." Before she could respond, Mikey came upstairs. He must have just gotten home from school. He saw the scene. Henry on the floor bleeding, Mom looking frantic, me me standing there with my fists clenched. Mikey immediately started crying. He was only 12. Mom rushed to him and pulled him close, shielding him from the sight of Henry. "It's okay, baby," she whispered to him. "Your brother hurt Daddy, but everything's going to be okay," I tried to explain. "Mikey, he's not who you think he is. But Mikey just screamed and ran to his room, slamming the door behind him. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what my mom had said when she came home. She knew. She had to know. I snuck into Henry's office and took his laptop. I needed evidence, something to show Mikey, to show anyone who would listen. But the laptop was wiped clean. The only thing on it was a single file, a draft of an email. It was addressed to a lawyer. The subject line read, "Request for name change denial appeal." I took pictures of it with my phone before putting the laptop back. The next day at school, I couldn't focus on anything. I was sleep deprived and jumping at every sound. After my last class, the principal called me into his office. There was a woman there in a suit. She introduced herself as a child welfare officer. "Someone filed a report saying you attacked a family member," she explained. "They're concerned you might be unstable." I tried to defend myself, tried to explain about Henry, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They didn't arrest me, but the officer said she'd be following up. I was now flagged in their system. When I got home, everything had shifted. Henry flinched when I walked into the room, pretending to be scared of me. Mom kept saying I needed help and that my anger issues were concerning. That night, they started locking their bedroom door. The next morning, Mom told me I needed to stay at Aunt Patricia's house, just for a while. She told me it was for my own good, that I was acting out because of teenage hormones and pressure from school. I didn't want to go, but I also didn't want to stay in that house with Henry, so I packed a bag and let her drive me to Aunt Patricia's. In the car, she kept talking about how much Henry had done for our family, how he'd saved us. I didn't say a word. Aunt Patricia welcomed me with open arms, but I could tell she was confused. After Mom left, she sat me down at her kitchen table. "Your mom says you attacked Henry out of nowhere," she said, pouring me some orange juice. "That doesn't sound like you at all. His name isn't Henry," I said. "It's Troy, and he's a convicted criminal." Aunt Patricia's eyebrows shot up. "Troy? That's strange. I remember seeing your biological father's name on some old insurance paperwork years ago, and it definitely wasn't Troy." That's when we started digging. Together, we called the court clerk's office in the county where Henry had lived before. It turned out his name change had been denied, not granted. He'd simply been using a fake name on job applications and documents ever since. "That's identity fraud," Aunt Patricia said, her face grim. "That's a crime." She called her friend Nathan, who was a lawyer. He said we could potentially go to civil court for identity fraud and maybe get a restraining order, but he warned us it would be risky, especially if Mom testified on Henry's behalf. I gathered everything I had, screenshots of texts from Henry with contradicting timelines, voicemail recordings where he mentioned his past mistakes, and the scanned documents from my half-brother. I sent it all to Nathan, but before we could even start building a legal case, something happened that changed everything. Mikey ran away. A police officer found Mikey at the local park, sitting on a swing and crying. When they asked him why he ran away, he said he didn't want to live in a house where people screamed all the time. The officer called Child Protective Services, and they launched a full investigation into both my mom and Henry. I found out about Mikey running away when Aunt Patricia got a call from my mom. She was hysterical, blaming me for everything. I could hear her screaming through the phone even though it wasn't on speaker. Aunt Patricia tried to calm her down, but Mom wasn't having it. Her voice kept rising higher and higher until it cracked with emotion. After she hung up, Aunt Patricia looked at me with sad eyes, the wrinkles around them more pronounced than usual. "Your mom says CPS is involved now. They're interviewing Mikey at the station." My stomach dropped like I'd just gone over a steep hill on a roller coaster. I wanted Henry gone, not for Mikey to get caught up in all this. My little brother was only 12. He shouldn't have to deal with any of this. "Can we go there? I need to see him." We drove to the police station in Aunt Patricia's old blue Honda. The whole way there, I kept imagining Mikey alone and scared, surrounded by strangers asking him questions he didn't understand. When we arrived, the station buzzed with fluorescent lights and the constant ringing of phones. They wouldn't let us see Mikey right away. We had to wait in this tiny room with uncomfortable plastic chairs for almost 2 hours. The walls were a pale, institutional green that reminded me of hospital corridors. I kept bouncing my leg up and down until Aunt Patricia put her hand on my knee to stop me. "Try to stay calm," she whispered. "For Mikey's sake." When they finally brought Mikey in, he looked so small, like he'd somehow shrunk since I last saw him. His favorite dinosaur t-shirt was wrinkled and had a stain on the collar. His eyes were red and puffy from crying, and his dark hair stuck up in places like he'd been running his hands through it. He wouldn't look at me at first, just stared at his shoes, the light-up ones Mom had bought him for his birthday last month. "Hey, buddy," I said, trying to sound normal, though my voice came out strained. "You okay?" He shrugged, his thin shoulders rising and falling under his t-shirt. The social worker, this lady named Rebecca, with a kind face but tired eyes and silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun, explained that Mikey would be staying with Aunt Patricia temporarily while they they sorted everything out. I was relieved he wouldn't have to go back to that house with Henry. The thought of my little brother under the same roof as that man made my skin crawl. As we were leaving, my mom showed up. She looked like a complete mess, hair all over the place, mascara running down her face, wearing mismatched clothes like she'd dressed in the dark. She tried to hug Mikey, but he flinched away from her, pressing himself against Aunt Patricia's side. That seemed to break something in her. The desperation in her eyes turned to anger in an instant. She pointed at me, her finger trembling. "This is all your fault. You're tearing this family apart." I didn't say anything. What was the point? She was too far gone, trapped in her own version of reality, where Henry was the savior she'd been waiting for all these years. The social worker stepped between us, her voice firm but professional. "Ma'am, please calm down. This isn't helping your case." Mom turned on her then, her face flushing red. "My case? I'm a good mother. I've always been a good mother. Ask him." She jabbed her finger toward me again. "I worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over their heads. I never missed a school conference." Before I could respond, she dropped a bomb. "I'm pregnant. Did he tell you that? I'm carrying Henry's baby." Everyone went quiet. The air in the room seemed to thicken. I looked at her stomach, trying to see if there was any truth to it, or if this was just another manipulation. She wasn't showing, but that didn't mean anything. The timing would be about right. They'd been together for over a year. The thought of Henry having another child made me feel sick. The social worker guided my mom to a separate room, her hand gently but firmly on Mom's elbow. Aunt Patricia took me and Mikey home, her face set in a grim expression I rarely saw. In the car, Mikey finally spoke to me, his voice small in the quiet interior. "Is it true what Mom said about the baby?" I shrugged, watching raindrops begin to spatter against the windshield. "I don't know, buddy. Maybe." "And is it true what you said about Dad?" He couldn't even say Henry's name, his voice catching on the word Dad like it hurt his throat. I looked at Aunt Patricia, unsure how much to tell him. She nodded slightly, her eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror, so I took a deep breath. "Yeah, Mikey, it's true. He's not who he said he was. His real name is Henry, and he did some really bad things before he met us." Mikey was quiet for a long time, his fingers tracing patterns on the foggy window beside him. Then he asked, "Is that why you hit him?" "Yeah, I found out what he did, and I got really angry." The memory of my fist connecting with Henry's face flashed through my mind, the shock in his eyes, the satisfaction I'd felt for that brief moment before everything fell apart. "I get really angry sometimes too," Mikey said quietly, "but Mom says we're not supposed to hit people when we're angry." I couldn't argue with that. My little brother's simple moral clarity cut through all my justifications. "You're right. I shouldn't have hit him. I should have told an adult instead." The next few days were weird, like we were living in some alternate reality. Mikey and I stayed at Aunt Patricia's house, a cozy 2-story with a garden out back and family photos covering every wall. She had this spare bedroom with bunk beds from when her kids were younger. Mikey took the top bunk and I took the bottom. At night, I could hear him crying sometimes, muffled sobs into his pillow. But when I asked if he was okay, he'd always say he was fine. I'd lie there in the darkness, listening to him try to be brave, feeling like I'd failed him somehow. Aunt Patricia was amazing through all of it. She made us pancakes every morning, chocolate chip for Mikey, blueberry for me, and helped Mikey with his homework. She even drove him to school and picked him up, so his routine wouldn't be too disrupted. She never complained, though I could see the strain in her eyes sometimes when she thought we weren't looking. Meanwhile, Nathan the lawyer was looking into our options. He was a friend of Aunt Patricia's from college, with salt and pepper hair and glasses that kept sliding down his nose. He said that without hard evidence, it would be tough to get a restraining order against Henry. The court documents from my half-brother were helpful, but they were old, and his records had been sealed after his release. We needed something current, something that proved Henry was still a threat. That's when I remembered the laptop. I had taken pictures of that email draft about the name change appeal. I showed them to Nathan, and his eyes lit up behind his glasses. "This is good," he said, tapping the screen of my phone. "This proves he's still using a false identity. We can work with this." A week after Mikey ran away, we had a custody hearing. The courthouse was imposing, all marble and echoing hallways. The judge was this older lady with silver hair, cut in a precise bob and sharp eyes that seemed to see right through you. She listened as the social worker explained the situation. Mikey running away, the allegations against Henry, my mom's erratic behavior. When it was my turn to speak, I tried to stay calm, though my hands were shaking. I explained how I found out about Henry's past, how my mom seemed to know about it, and how they had both tried to make me look crazy when I confronted them. I described how Henry had gradually isolated us from friends and family, how he'd inserted himself into every aspect of our lives. The judge asked a lot of questions, her pen never stopping as she made notes. She wanted to know if I had ever seen Henry do anything inappropriate with Mikey. I hadn't, and I made that clear. Whatever Henry was, he had been careful around us. He'd played the perfect stepfather role, right up until I discovered who he really was. In the end, the judge decided that Mikey would stay with Aunt Patricia for now, with supervised visits from my mom. Henry wasn't allowed to be present during these visits. The judge also ordered my mom to undergo a psychological evaluation, her tone making it clear this wasn't optional. Mom was furious. She stormed out of the courtroom, her heels clicking angrily on the marble floor, not even saying goodbye to Mikey. Henry followed her, giving me this look that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't anger, it was calculation, like he was figuring out how to get back at me. His eyes were cold and empty, and for the first time, I saw him clearly for what he was. 2 days later, Aunt Patricia got a call from the hospital. Mom had collapsed at work and been rushed to the emergency room. The doctors said she was under extreme stress, and she admitted to taking too many sleeping pills. They weren't sure if it was a sewer's lied attempt or an accident. The thought of either possibility made me feel hollow inside. I didn't want to see her, but Mikey was worried sick, his face pale and drawn. So Aunt Patricia drove us to the hospital, a sprawling complex of buildings on the edge of town. Mom was in a private room, looking pale and small against the white sheets. An IV dripped steadily beside her bed. When she saw Mikey, she started crying and held out her arms. He ran to her and hugged her tight, burying his face in her shoulder. I stayed by the door, not sure what to do. The antiseptic smell of the hospital made my stomach turn. Mom looked at me over Mikey's shoulder, her eyes red and puffy, dark circles beneath them like bruises. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." I didn't know if she was apologizing for bringing Henry into our lives, for not believing me, or for trying to hurt herself. Maybe all of it. I just nodded and said, "It's okay," even though it wasn't. Nothing about this situation was okay. The doctor came in, a woman with a gentle voice and efficient movements. She explained that Mom would need to stay for a few days for observation. They were also recommending a psychiatric evaluation. Mom agreed to everything, which surprised me. She seemed broken somehow, like all the fight had gone out of her. It was unsettling to see her this way. She'd always been so strong, so determined. As we were leaving, a nurse pulled me aside. "Your mother asked me to give you this," she said, handing me a folded piece of paper. It felt weightless in my hand, but somehow heavy with meaning. I waited until we were in the car to read it. It was a short note in my mom's handwriting, the letters shaky but legible. I knew something was wrong with him, but I convinced myself it wasn't true because I needed to believe in him. I was just so tired of doing everything alone. "Please forgive me. I love you both more than anything." I showed the note to Aunt Patricia when we got home. She read it and sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. "Do you believe her?" I shrugged, staring out the kitchen window at the maple tree in her backyard. I don't know. Maybe she really didn't know at first, but she found out eventually, and she stayed with him anyway. "People do strange things when they're desperate," Aunt Patricia said, her voice soft. "Your mom has been on her own for a long time." The next day, we got a call from Nathan. He had some news about Henry. Apparently, after my mom was hospitalized, Henry had tried to leave town, but he was pulled over for a routine traffic stop, and when the officer ran his ID, it didn't match the legal registry. He was arrested on identity fraud and obstruction charges. "They're reopening his case under his legal name," Nathan explained, his voice crackling through the speaker. "This could lead to more charges, especially if they find evidence he violated the terms of his release." I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Henry was in jail. He couldn't hurt Mikey or manipulate my mom anymore, but part of me was still worried. What if he got out? What if he came looking for us? I'd seen enough crime shows to know that restraining orders were just pieces of paper. They couldn't stop someone determined to cause harm. A few days later, my mom was released from the hospital. She went straight from there to her court-ordered psychological evaluation. The results would determine whether she could regain custody of Mikey. I found myself hoping, for Mikey's sake, that she'd get the help she needed. While we waited for the evaluation results, life settled into a new routine. I went back to school, trying to focus on my upcoming graduation. The whispers and stares had mostly died down, though occasionally I'd catch someone looking at me with that mixture of curiosity and pity that made my skin crawl. Mikey seemed to be doing better at Aunt Patricia's. He was sleeping through the night now and even smiling sometimes. He'd made friends with the neighbor's kid, a boy his age named Jordan, who had a collection of dinosaur figures that Mikey coveted. One evening, as I was helping Mikey with his science homework, something about the water cycle that he was struggling to understand, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something told me I should. "Hello?" I said, stepping into the hallway so I wouldn't disturb Mikey, who was carefully coloring a diagram of clouds and rain. "Is this Mark?" a man's voice asked. It sounded vaguely familiar, like someone I'd met once but couldn't quite place. "Yeah, who's this?" "It's Elliot, your half-brother." I nearly dropped the phone. I hadn't spoken to him since that day he sent me the court documents about Henry, the documents that had changed everything. "Oh, hey," I didn't know what else to say. "What do you say to someone who shares your blood through a monster?" "I heard they arrested him," Elliot said. "I wanted to check if you and your brother are okay." I was surprised by his concern. We were practically strangers, connected only by Henry's DNA. "Yeah, we're staying with our aunt. My mom's getting help." There was a pause, filled with the static of the connection. "I'm sorry about all this. I know how it feels to have your world turned upside down because of him." We talked for almost an hour. Elliot told me about his life after Henry went to prison the first time, how his mom had struggled with addiction and depression, how he'd bounced around foster homes until his grandparents finally took him in. How he still had nightmares sometimes, even at 25. It gets better, he said before we hung up. Not right away, and not completely, but it does get better. The next day, we got the results of my mom's psychological evaluation. The therapist concluded that she was suffering from depression and anxiety, exacerbated by financial stress and single parenthood. She wasn't a danger to Mikey, but she needed ongoing therapy and support. The report mentioned her poor judgment in relationships and tendency toward emotional dependence, which felt like clinical ways of saying she kept choosing men who were bad for us. The judge modified her ruling. Mom could have Mikey back, but with conditions. She had to attend weekly therapy sessions and have bi-weekly check-ins with Aunt Patricia present. It wasn't perfect, but it was something, a chance for her to rebuild her relationship with Mikey. When the judge asked me if I wanted to return home too, I hesitated. I looked at my mom, sitting there with tears in her eyes, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Then I looked at Aunt Patricia, who had been my rock through all of this, who had opened her home and heart to us without question. I'd like to stay with Aunt Patricia, I said finally, at least until graduation. Mom looked hurt, but she nodded. She understood, or at least I hoped she did. I wasn't rejecting her. I just needed space to heal. As we were leaving the courthouse, I overheard two officers talking about Henry's case. They mentioned that the prosecutor was pushing for a longer sentence because of his history and the identity fraud. It sounded like he wouldn't be getting out anytime soon. The relief I felt was so intense, it made me dizzy. Life slowly started to piece itself back together. Mom found a smaller apartment, one she could afford on her own, without having to work double shifts. It was in a different neighborhood, away from the memories of Henry. She got a new job with better hours, so she could be home more for Mikey, and she never missed a therapy appointment. Sometimes, when she dropped Mikey off at Aunt Patricia's, I'd see a glimpse of the mom I remembered from before, the one who laughed easily and looked at us like we were the center of her universe. I stayed with Aunt Patricia and finished my senior year. It was quiet there, safe. The nightmares came less frequently. I helped Mikey with homework on weekends and watched him slowly begin to trust again. He still had bad dreams sometimes, but they were getting less frequent. He started playing soccer again, something he'd loved before Henry came into our lives. 1 year after everything fell apart, Henry was convicted, not for his original crimes, which were beyond the statute of limitations, but for the fraud, false documentation, and obstruction. He was sentenced to several years in state prison, with no contact with minors allowed after his release. When Nathan called to tell us the news, I felt like I could finally breathe properly again. I graduated as valedictorian of my class. As I stood at the podium looking out at the crowd, the sea of faces blurring except for the ones that mattered, I saw my mom and Mikey sitting next to Aunt Patricia. They were all smiling up at me, proud. Mom had put on weight, her face fuller and healthier than it had been in months. Mikey was holding a homemade sign that said, "My brother rocks," in wobbly letters. In my speech, I didn't mention any of what had happened. Instead, I said, "Some people get family by blood, some by force, and some by truth. I chose mine." I looked at my aunt in the crowd, then at my mom and Mikey, the people who had weathered the storm with me. After the ceremony, Mom hugged me tight, the scent of her familiar perfume enveloping me. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered, "and I'm so sorry for everything." I hugged her back, feeling the baby bump between us, a reminder of what was lost and what was still to come. "I know, Mom, I know." That summer, before heading off to college, I met up with Elliot again. We went fishing at this lake near his grandparents' house, the water reflecting the clear blue sky. We didn't talk much about Henry or the past. Instead, we talked about the future, his plans to become a social worker, my scholarship to study engineering. We were more than the pain that connected us. As we sat there watching our lines in the water, the gentle lapping of waves against the shore, a soothing rhythm, Elliot said something I'll never forget. "You know what the worst part was? Not what he did, but how long it took for anyone to believe me." I nodded. I knew exactly what he meant. The isolation of carrying a truth no one wants to hear. The day I left for college, Mikey gave me this drawing he'd made. It was our family. Mom, him, me, and Aunt Patricia. No Henry, just us. The people who mattered. The people who stayed. He'd drawn Mom with a round belly and a tiny figure he said was our new sister. The ultrasound had confirmed it was a girl. "Don't forget us," he said, hugging me goodbye, his arms tight around my waist. "Never," I promised, and I meant it. No matter how far I went, they would always be my anchor, my truth, my chosen family. I moved into my dorm at college the next week. It was this tiny room with 2 beds, 2 desks, and barely enough space to turn around. My roommate Brandon was this computer science major from Seattle who stayed up late coding and drank way too much energy drinks. He was cool though, minded his own business, and didn't ask too many questions when I'd get those middle-of-the-night calls from Mikey after he had a nightmare. College was weird at first. Everyone there was starting fresh, no baggage, no history. Meanwhile, I was carrying around this whole mess in my head. I'd be sitting in calculus, trying to focus on derivatives, and suddenly remember the sound Henry made when I knocked him to the floor. Or I'd be in the dining hall and see a dad visiting his his kid and wonder what kind of father Henry would have been to my little sister. I called home every Sunday night. Aunt Patricia would update me on everything. Mom's therapy progress, Mikey's soccer games, the baby preparations. Mom was due in November, right around midterms. She'd decided to name the baby Emma. I wasn't sure how I felt about having a half-sister who shared DNA with Henry, but I tried not to think about it too much. It wasn't the baby's fault who her father was. One Tuesday in October, I got a call from Mom during my physics lab. I stepped outside to answer it, figuring it was about the baby. "Hey Mom, everything okay?" Her voice was shaking. "Henry's lawyer contacted me. He's trying to get visitation rights for the baby." I nearly dropped my phone. "What? How can he do that from prison?" "I don't know. The lawyer said something about establishing paternity and parental rights before Emma is born." She was crying now. "I can't let him near her. I can't." I skipped the rest of my classes that day and called Nathan. He explained that in our state, even incarcerated parents can petition for visitation rights. But given Henry's history and current charges, it was unlikely a judge would grant them. "Still," Nathan said, "we should be prepared. Can you come home this weekend? We need to strategize." I caught a bus home Friday after my morning classes. The whole ride I kept thinking about Henry trying to get his hands on my baby sister. The thought made me sick. I'd protected Mikey, but how could I protect a baby I hadn't even met yet? When I got to Aunt Patricia's house, everyone was already there. Mom, Mikey, Nathan, and this lady named Denise, who was Mom's therapist. They were sitting around the dining room table with papers spread out everywhere. Mom looked better than I expected. Her pregnancy suited her. She had this glow about her despite the stress. She hugged me tight when I walked in, her belly pressing against me. "Thanks for coming," she whispered. I didn't know who else to call. We spent the whole weekend preparing. Nathan had this plan to counter Henry's petition with evidence of his past crimes and his identity fraud. Denise was going to testify about Mom's progress in therapy and how contact with Henry would be detrimental to her mental health. I was supposed to write a statement about what happened the day I discovered who Henry really was. Writing that statement was harder than I expected. I had to relive every moment: the Facebook message from Elliot, the court documents, Henry standing over me, the sound of his ribs cracking under my boots. I wrote it all down, every ugly detail. When I was done, I felt drained but somehow lighter, like I'd finally put down something heavy I'd been carrying. Sunday night, as I was packing to head back to campus, Mikey came into my old room at Aunt Patricia's. He sat on the bed, watching me fold my clothes. "Is the bad man going to take Emma?" he asked, his voice small. I stopped packing and sat next to him. "No way. We're not going to let that happen. Promise?" "I promise." I ruffled his hair. "Nobody messes with our family." He nodded, looking serious. Then he handed me a folded piece of paper. "I made this for Emma. Can you keep it safe until she's born?" It was a drawing of a shield with our family's names written on it. Mom, Mikey, me, Aunt Patricia, and Emma in the middle. Around the edge, he'd written, "No bad guys allowed." "This is perfect," I told him. "Emma's going to love it." The hearing for Henry's petition was scheduled for early November, just a week before Mom's due date. I arranged to take my midterms early so I could be there. My professors were surprisingly understanding when I explained the situation. Well, a sanitized version of it. I just said my stepdad was in prison and trying to get custody of my unborn sister. That was enough to get their sympathy. The day before the hearing, Nathan called with news. "Henry's been caught with contraband in prison. They found a cell phone in his cell." "So what does that mean for us?" I asked, throwing clothes into my duffel bag as I prepared to head home again. "It means he's lost privileges and gotten additional time added to his sentence. But more importantly, it shows he's still breaking rules. Not exactly the behavior of someone who should be granted visitation with an infant." I felt a surge of hope. Maybe this would be enough to convince the judge. The courthouse was the same one where we'd had the custody hearing for Mikey. Same imposing marble hallways, same echoing footsteps. But this time I wasn't scared. I was angry. How dare Henry try to worm his way back into our lives? How dare he think he had any right to my sister? We sat on one side of the courtroom. Me, Mom, Aunt Patricia, Nathan, and Denise. On the other side was just Henry's lawyer, this slick guy in an expensive suit named Keith. Henry himself wasn't there. They don't usually transport prisoners for family court hearings unless absolutely necessary. The judge was different this time. An older man with bushy eyebrows and reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. He looked like he'd seen it all and wasn't impressed by any of it. As the hearing began, Keith argued that Henry had made mistakes but was committed to being part of his daughter's life. He talked about rehabilitation and second chances, his voice smooth as butter. I watched Mom's hands clench into fists on her lap as he spoke. Then it was our turn. Nathan presented evidence of Henry's crimes, his identity fraud, and his recent contraband violation. Denise testified about Mom's progress and how contact with Henry would be harmful. I read my statement, my voice steady even as I described the worst day of my life. The judge listened to it all without much reaction. When everyone was done, he looked at Mom over his glasses. "Ms. Johnson, you're due to give birth soon, correct?" Mom nodded. "Next week, Your Honor. And you were unaware of the father's criminal history when you entered into a relationship with him." "I was," Mom said firmly. "If I had known, I never would have let him near my children. The judge nodded, making a note. Then he looked at Keith. Counsel, your client has demonstrated a pattern of deception and rule-breaking that spans decades. He used a false identity to enter into a relationship with Ms. Johnson. He violated the terms of his release by not disclosing his status to her, and now he's been caught with contraband in prison. Keith started to argue, but the judge held up his hand. I've heard enough. Petition denied. Furthermore, I'm issuing a no-contact order between the minor child and the petitioner. Ms. Johnson, you are not required to list him on the birth certificate if you choose not to. I felt a wave of relief so strong it made me dizzy. Mom started crying, quiet tears running down her face. Aunt Patricia squeezed her hand. As we were leaving the courthouse, Keith approached us. This isn't over, he said quietly. My client is very determined. Nathan stepped between us. It is over. Your client comes near this family again, and will add harassment to his charges. Keith just smiled, this cold little smile that didn't reach his eyes, and walked away. That night, we celebrated at Aunt Patricia's house. She made lasagna, my favorite, and Mikey helped her bake cookies for dessert. We sat around the table talking and laughing, the tension of the last few months finally starting to lift. After dinner, Mom pulled me aside. I want to ask you something, she said, her hand resting on her belly. Would you be Emma's godfather? I was surprised. Me? But I'm only 18. I know, but you protected Mikey when I couldn't see the danger. You stood up to Henry when I was too blind to do it myself. There's no one I trust more with my children's safety. I didn't know what to say. Part of me was still angry at her for bringing Henry into our lives, for not believing me at first. But looking at her now, I could see how much she'd changed, how hard she was trying to make things right. Okay, I said finally. I'll do it. 3 days later, at 2 a.m., Aunt Patricia shook me awake. Your mom's in labor. We need to go to the hospital. We woke Mikey up and piled into the car. The hospital was quiet at that hour, just a few nurses at the station and the occasional doctor walking by. They directed us to the maternity ward, where Mom was already in a room, hooked up to monitors. She looked exhausted, but smiled when she saw us. Perfect timing, she said. Things are moving fast. Aunt Patricia took Mikey to the waiting room with some coloring books and snacks, while I stayed with Mom. I held her hand through contractions, let her squeeze until my fingers went numb. Between contractions, we talked about everything and nothing. My classes, Mikey's soccer team, names for the baby. She was still set on Emma, but wanted a middle name. What about Patricia? I suggested. After the aunt who saved us all. Mom smiled. Emma Patricia Johnson. I like it. Emma was born at 5:47 a.m., just as the sun was starting to rise. She was tiny and red-faced and perfect, with a tuft of dark hair like Mikey's. When the nurse placed her in Mom's arms, I saw my mother's face transform. All the worry lines smoothed out, replaced by a look of pure love. Do you want to hold her? Mom asked me. I was terrified I'd drop her, but I carefully took Emma in my arms. She was so light, like holding a loaf of bread. Her eyes were scrunched shut, her tiny fists balled up against her chest. I looked at her and felt this fierce protectiveness wash over me. This little person who shared my blood, but not my history, who would never know the man who helped create her. Hi, Emma, I whispered. I'm your big brother. I'm going to make sure nothing bad ever happens to you. Mikey was ecstatic when he got to meet her. He kept asking if she could play soccer with him, and we had to explain that babies can't play sports right away. He gave her the shield drawing, which Mom promised to hang in the nursery. I went back to college the next day, reluctant to leave but needing to catch up on the classes I'd missed. Life settled into a new rhythm. I'd come home on weekends when I could, help with Mikey's homework, and take turns holding Emma so Mom could shower or nap. Aunt Patricia was there almost every day, becoming the grandmother Emma would never have. Mom's parents had died years ago, and Henry's parents were out of the picture. In December, we got news that Henry had been transferred to a maximum security prison after another contraband incident. This time, they'd found a shiv in his cell. Nathan said he'd probably be there for the full length of his sentence now, maybe longer. It was like a weight lifted off all of us. Christmas that year was at Aunt Patricia's house. She put up this massive tree that nearly touched the ceiling, covered in ornaments she'd collected over decades. Mikey was in charge of arranging the presents underneath, taking his job very seriously. Emma, now 6 weeks old, slept through most of it in her bassinet, waking only to eat and get her diaper changed. Mom seemed happier than I'd seen her in years. She'd started taking online classes to finish her degree, something she'd abandoned when she got pregnant with me. She talked about maybe becoming a teacher someday when Emma was in school. As we sat around the tree opening presents, I looked at my weird little family. My mom, who had made terrible mistakes but was working hard to fix them. My little brother, who was braver than any kid should have to be. My baby sister, who would grow up never knowing the darkness that had touched our lives. And my aunt, who had opened her home and heart when we needed it most. It wasn't perfect. We all still had nightmares sometimes. Mom still had days when guilt overwhelmed her. Mikey still flinched at loud noises. I still found myself checking locks twice, looking over my shoulder in parking lots. But we were healing together. The next semester, I joined this support group on campus for students who'd been affected by family trauma. I didn't talk much at first, just just listened to other people's stories. But eventually, I shared mine. Not all of it, just pieces. How my stepdad wasn't who he claimed to be. How my mom had chosen him over us at first. How we were putting the pieces back together now. After one meeting, this girl named Ashley came up to me. She had short blue hair and more earrings than I could count. My stepdad was a creep too, she said matter-of-factly. Not as bad as yours sounds, but bad enough. Took me years to trust men again. We started getting coffee after meetings, just talking at first, then more. She was smart and funny and didn't look at me with pity when I talked about my family. By spring, we were dating. The first time I brought her home to meet everyone, I was nervous. What if she saw my family and ran? But she fit right in, helping mom with dinner, playing video games with Mikey, cooing over Emma, who was starting to smile and grab at things. Later, as we drove back to campus, Ashley said, "Your family's pretty great, you know that?" I thought about it, about all we'd been through, all we'd survived. "Yeah," I said, "they really are." That summer, I got an internship that kept me near campus, but I drove home every weekend. Emma was crawling by then, getting into everything. Mikey had made the all-star soccer team and talked non-stop about his coach and teammates. Mom had finished her first year of online classes with straight A's. One Sunday, as I was getting ready to drive back to campus, Mom handed me an envelope. "This came for you," she said. "It's from the prison." My heart raced as I took it. Had Henry written to me? What could he possibly have to say? But when I opened it, it wasn't from Henry. It was from the prison administration, informing me that Henry had been denied parole due to his behavior violations. He wouldn't be eligible again for 5 more years. I showed it to Mom, who read it and then hugged me tight. "It's really over," she whispered. "It's been over," I told her. "We just needed the paperwork to catch up." As I drove back to campus that night, I thought about how different things were from a year ago. How much had changed. How much we had all changed. I used to think family was this fixed thing, something you were born into and stuck with. But now I knew better. Family was something you built, choice by choice, day by day. It was Mom choosing therapy over denial. Mikey choosing bravery over fear. Aunt Patricia choosing to stand with us when she could have walked away. And me choosing to forgive, to stay connected, to be the brother and son and godfather my family needed. It wasn't always easy. There were still hard days, still moments when the past felt too close. But we were moving forward, one step at a time, together, and that was enough.